throughout the presentation to open it up for any questions or discussion. So there'll be opportunities for you guys to input throughout the whole thing. And if you do have a question, I mean, there's not so many people that you can't just ask. So with that, Diane, I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint presentation. Can everyone see that?
Yes. It says McCall Area Code Update Workshop number 3.
Perfect. All right. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Diane.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for hanging in there for our third workshop, especially the council for joining us this morning after a late night meeting. If you go to the next slide, Michelle. So as Michelle mentions, we're going to focus today on the last part of the current code amendments that are under consideration related to development standards. So first of all, just give a little recap from our prior meetings, just so we refresh ourselves what we've already looked at, and then I'll focus in on these development standard changes, and then we'll talk about next steps. And as Michelle mentioned, we have some breaks for anybody to ask questions or provide us with some comments. Your feedback so far has been very helpful to us as we move forward. So next slide. So in July, we looked at the overall purposes of these code updates, and we gave a little primer on zoning, and then an overview of what we were changing, and we gathered a lot of good recommendations and suggestions from everyone. And then August, we focused on a major chunk of these current changes related to design, for the most part taking provisions of that are in the McCall design guidelines and amending them as standards in the zoning code. And then we also talked about changes to the design review process to make it a little more simple and expedient, and then also changes to the two overlay districts. Okay. So today we're going to focus on the development standards, and I'd like to contrast them with other provisions in the zoning code. We usually focus on zoning district regulations, which are really where uses should be located, and that's defined through zoning districts. And then within each district, what are the uses that should happen in each of those districts? The design standards are really focusing on how that development should happen. And a big part of that was the design standards that we looked at last time. And today we're looking at some other development standards that we're proposing to change. So the next slide. So the McCall Area Zoning Code includes Chapter 8, which are called the General Development Standards. For the most part, these are standards that apply in all districts, although when you look down the list, you'll see some provisions that are specific to a particular zoning district. And you can see that there's a whole array of standards from, snow storage to parking to landscaping. So there's a wide range of the kind of standards that are currently in the code. Next slide. So our focus is on these highlighted areas, our current work in terms of timber harvesting, fire hazard mitigation, parking in internal circulation areas, driveways, loading areas, fences, and we're adding walls to that section, landscaping and buffering, snow storage, and then we're adding 2 new sections related to site design and design location and screening areas. You'll see just before those 2 last highlighted areas, local housing, density bonus program, and seasonal dwelling units. Those are the 2 sections that we added earlier this year related to those 2 topics. And we've got some future work identified. If you remember, we had a little parking lot of code provisions that are underway, but we haven't worked on yet. And so there's future work in the area of that first section, general requirements, looking at parking standards, and then finally animal regulations, which I think came about as your recent discussion on improving urban agriculture in the city. So is there, I guess, Mayor, I'd stop there and see if there's any questions or comments at this point. Okay. Do you want to move on to the next slide then? So the reasons for these changes to the development standards that we're going to talk about today are, as always, to implement the goals and policies of the comprehensive plan. And then again, there's some provisions that were in the McCall guidelines that we would like to put into the zoning code. And there's some current policies and practices that interface with other parts of the city responsibilities, and so we want to update those. And then finally, as always, we're trying to just clean up the zoning code, making it more user-friendly by reorganizing, simplifying provisions, and there are, in some cases, some inconsistencies to resolve. So that's the general purpose for what we're doing. So the first section that we are looking at amending are three sections that I want to talk about kind of together because they're so interrelated, and they can create some potential conflicts in terms of the objectives for these three areas. And they are timber harvest, fire mitigation, and landscaping. And those are three separate sections in this chapter 8. And these three sections are really influenced by provisions in the comprehensive plan, which look to maintain the urban forest and as a key part of your green infrastructure. And particularly, there's a very explicit policy in the comprehensive plan to create development standards to protect heritage trees and native vegetation. And so that's one of the main motivations for looking at this landscaping section. There's also goals not to lose any tree canopy, to maintain other native vegetation, and then a goal to create incentives for maintaining the natural environment, and then identify and maintain heritage trees. So it's quite a list, but it's important to not only the environmental character of McCall, but also because that character is so interwoven with your social and economic vitality. And if you would allow me, I just tell you a short story from my experience as the community development director for Carmel, California. You know, very much smaller geographically and population-wise to McCall, but a lot of similar characteristics where we had a stand of native Monterey pines, a tree canopy of native Monterey pines and California live oaks. And in the case of Monterey pines, that coastal area of California is one of the few areas in the world where that particular species exists. So, you know, very important to the community and to the character of the community. And at the same time, the city had been divided into 4,000 square foot lots, which are the smallest lots that you see here in the city of McCall. And so you can imagine that given the proximity to the coast, these small little lots were very valuable and very precious. And I know Morgan has shared with me that she's had a similar experience where prospective property owners come to the city and they rave about the natural environment. And then that's why they're attracted to the community because of the trees and this native setting. And then the next time you see that person is when they come in with building plans that include removing a large part of that, that important tree canopy or vegetation. And so it's this dilemma where high value properties drive these kind of needs. but at the same time, they can chip away bit by bit, application by application, at the reason which attracted people there to begin with. So this is a very important area, I think, for the community, as well as you've got an additional challenge that's become so apparent in recent weeks with the potential for fire hazards. And so balancing the needs of people to build and develop in a community and protect that natural environment with this overlay of protecting the community, the safety of the community, is a really big challenge. So we've spent a lot of time in these three areas, and we're continuing to have some discussions next week with the city arborist and take into consideration some recommendations that he and the tree committee have made in the past. So if you go to the next slide, Michelle.
Yeah, and Diane, if I could just add a little bit more about this. I mean, as recent as just yesterday, we got a call about a property that hasn't applied for a building permit, and it was heavily treed with some decent sized trees and just completely clear cut to the stumps. And so I think exactly what Diane's saying is that we have an issue where people are going out and clearing properties without adhering to the code. And so one of the things I think we want to talk with our city arborist, who's Kurt Wolf, one, because he's having an issue that he can't even really keep up with all the requests to go to all the properties which are, within the city and the impact area. And then two is also looking at, at some point, people are interested in removing trees for view sheds and things like that. And some of these are these massive heritage trees. And so, so we're having kind of a situation where people are doing tree removal on the weekends or after hours when they don't think they're going to get caught, and then the neighbors call us and let us know what's happening. And we really, at this point, don't have a good way of addressing that situation. So that's also something that we'll be looking into is how do we actually enforce these codes that we have in place, and are there consequences, and what are those consequences if you do tree removal sort of illegally. So I just wanted to add that because this is something that comes up every single year, and it's getting worse and worse, I think, with more and more development. And so it's definitely an issue that we're looking at the staff level.
So the first section that we looked at is timber harvest. And again, this is the area that's kind of ongoing discussion with the city arborist, as Michelle just described. We're not proposing any change to allowances for salvage of dead and dying or hazardous timber material. And there's still a required conditional use permit for timber harvesting that's in the code.
Can I ask a question really quick there, Diane?
Sure.
So the county actually, we use Stephanie Nelson for wildfire mitigation. Have you guys included in all of this the wildfire mitigation?
We're going to get to that in a minute here. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments at this point? So, in regards to that, thank you. We're Commissioner Maupin. We're going to include some new guidelines for assessment of fire hazard to be reviewed through a site design process that I'll talk about at the end of the presentation. And these are guidelines because of the differing character that you see throughout the community of the environmental conditions on the site. So they're a little bit general. They're not as specific as some communities might want them to be. There also is in the code a 30-foot defensible space zone, and we're looking at some different criteria for that area than currently exists. But otherwise, the current provisions for fire mitigation would remain the same. You want to go to the next one? And then the final area of these three is landscaping. And here's where we're relying heavily on adopting provisions from the McCall design guidelines that had some very good provisions, guidelines for landscaping in different circumstances, because obviously you have a community that has a business and a more urban area, more built up, and then you have larger lots with lots of open area. So it provides some guidelines for those different circumstances. But in general, it also creates some new standards for every property in terms of use of drought tolerant and native species and irrigation systems, which are objectives are for water conservation. And then there are some new standards for the mix and required amount of trees and shrubs, and a provision that is that except for native grasses, that lawns be limited to 10% of the site area. That's probably the most significant change in that area of standards. So are there any questions and comments at this point on timber harvest, fire mitigation, or landscaping, those three sections?
I got one question, or one, I don't know if it's an idea. This is Robert Lyons. Would it be something feasible or possible that maybe once a month we get a report from the title company on sales in the area and send a letter to the new owners with the tree code? That way nobody would know, or they wouldn't say they didn't realize what the code was. I mean, it costs a little bit, but I know you can get a report from the title company of any, or the county for change of ownership within the city. Clearly wouldn't need to do it for condos, but even home sites that, or homes that already have a house there still could possibly cut trees down when they're not supposed to. So I don't know, just a generic letter to, hey, just want to let you know what the code is. And once a month, you probably do it for however long, but just as an idea.
Robert, that's something we could look into. Morgan Bisa, our city planner, is also on the phone. Do you have any comments or ideas about that?
Only that we have limited staff time, and that, you know, that would be, you know, an extra, it just seems like that would be a lot of work. I'm not saying it's not doable, but it's probably just something we'd have to evaluate moving forward, you know, how much time that takes and if we have the staff to get it done. We also have sent out notices, and I think it's time to do it again, to the companies that are removing trees, right? Because they are the professionals and they're the ones with the business license. And if they know the code, and if they're familiar, and if we're reminding them of the code and that there are penalties, then if a neighbor calls, you know, hopefully they wouldn't follow through with the tree request. And it's easier to educate, you know, 3 or 4 tree removal companies than it is, you know, 3,000 or 4,000 people or homes that are changing hands every year. Or 100, whatever the number is. I have no idea how many homes change hands every year.
Well, as another possibility, whether they would do it or not, most of the transactions are going to go through 2 of the local title companies. Occasionally they'll go through area title companies out of Boise, but if we provided them a letter, they might just include it in their closing package when they send out the final documents to the seller. It's just a matter of them including a page in that. So
that's a great idea. We could definitely look into that.
Both of them, they're great for the community. I think they would potentially, you know, just include that in their package at closing.
Yeah,
Right.
I think that's a great idea to work with the title companies.
So if you get me a letter, I'll take it to them.
Okay, thanks, Robert. I'll put it on the list.
All right.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, I guess we're ready to move on. So the next area I've aggregated under parking lots, loading areas, and driveways, and these all kind of relate to vehicles and how we manage and create standards for those 3 sections. In the code right now, there's 3 sections related to parking. There's parking standards, that means how many parking spaces are required. There's a section on location. We're just amending the 3rd section, which relates to parking design. And again, this is incorporating changes from the design guidelines, and it's really focused on large parking lots and how to improve the design of those to both buffer them from adjoining properties and improve the ability of pedestrian to navigate through those lots from their cars to the locations. And then on driveways, we are looking at standards for width, grade, and the maximum number of houses served by private driveways. These are all standards that are really focused on maintaining good access for fire equipment and safety concerns. And then the other part of that is improving the interface of driveways with the public right-of-way in terms of surfacing and setbacks to the right-of-way. And those are things we're working with on Public Works. There's some provisions in the subdivision code that we're relocating to these sections because they really relate more to zoning than subdivision. And so a number of objectives for these changes.
Yeah, and Diane, another item to add is looking at the width of maximum widths for driveways because that impacts snow removal.
Right. Okay, and then the last provisions are these 2 new sections. We've added a section called site design, which both is a way to integrate all the standards that we've already mentioned, like landscaping, into a review of as part of a site design process. It also addresses some standards for protection of other natural resources besides native vegetation and trees in terms of waterways. And then it also sets up some standards for grading and site modification. And we're working with Public Works on finalizing the provisions for that section. And then the last area is buffering service areas, whether they be electrical boxes or garbage areas or these ancillary support areas for mostly commercial buildings, and how to buffer those both visually and from a noise standpoint from adjacent properties. So there's some provisions that are already in the code there, that already exist in the code, that we're relocating to this section and then expanding it a little bit more under this category of service areas. So is there any questions about those last few sections? Parking, driveways, site design, service areas? Okay, so we're going to be done sooner, Mayor, than you expected. We are trying to wrap this up within the next week. We've gotten a lot of comments from you and from other city departments. And so we're trying to finalize all of that and wrap it up into a draft that we would take to the Planning and Zoning Commission for a short study session. So to this point, they are, other than staff, we really haven't made this draft available, but we would try to put it in a form that the commission could look at and have a short session on October 6th to ask any questions, to try to bring it to a public review draft that then we can take out and have a public hearing on that with the Planning and Zoning Commission on November 3rd. And the idea is still to try to wrap this up by the end of the year so it can take effective January 1st. And so bringing it to the City Council and the Board of Commissioners for public hearing in November and December. I think we're in a good place. I think this is doable. I think Michelle and I've talked about, we think this works. So we're going to keep it as our goal and really appreciate all the attention, the time that you've taken over the last 3 months to be part of these previews of the code amendments. So with that, I'd be glad to answer any other questions or hear any comments.
This is Mayor Bob. Thanks for that presentation, Diane. I wanted to just say from the mayor's perspective, having you and Michelle and staff break this into small parts that are doable, that we can focus on each meeting, has been extremely helpful to council. I believe it's been helpful to P&Z and to the county as well. So it's a good process you are following. I'm going to ask that Michelle help me with, let's make sure that the 3 entities that are on this call have a chance to ask any questions or make any comments before we wrap today's meeting up. Let's start with planning and zoning. I'd like to hear from everyone that's on the call. And Michelle, if you could just help me with making sure we go down the list of people that are on the call with us from P&Z.
Yeah, so do any of the planning and zoning commissioners have any comments or anything you want to add about these code sections? And one thing I might just add before we get into it is that Diane and I, we think having a draft for you to review in October, that draft will be publicly available for all the governing boards. That will hopefully give everybody time to really look at this and study it prior to the public hearing process. So you can still get us feedback. It's not, it's going to be a draft, but it gives you a little bit more time. Our concern was that, if we bring it to you and you're seeing it for the first time at the public hearing, it's dense and long and might be overwhelming. And so we wanted to make sure that you have enough time really to review it, get us any questions or comments, and then it can move through the process. We know it's kind of fast, but we like our code amendments to become effective January 1. It's just clean and easy. It's just an easy transition for staff and designers and everybody. And it's a way for us to get organized and let people know before the next development season. So that's sort of the reasoning for the timing in moving through this fall. We have a little bit of wiggle room in terms of meeting dates if they don't necessarily move through. The other thought is if there's kind of sticky points within the code, we can always take out maybe those sticky points and move the bulk of it through so that we're, as I mentioned, kind of getting ready for that next development season. By and large, I don't think most of this is very controversial. But we'll see. You never know. So that's the thought process behind it. But it looks like Scott Broyles is on the phone and maybe has a comment.
No, I'm on board with everything, and I like the way it's going. I'd like to see that stuff that you want us to look over, discuss before October 6th. I'd like to see that in some form by October 1 or 2 so that I can read it.
Yeah, we should have it. We should have it out a week prior to your meeting. We're still meeting internally with our different departments to really kind of go through all the different sections, because this heavily impacts the Parks Department and the City Arborist, as well as the Public Works Department. So there's a lot of crossover between the different departments and these development standards. So we're still kind of fine tuning some of those sections, but we'll try to get it out as soon as we can. That's our goal.
Okay, I just don't want to look like, all of us look like a fool on October 6th because nobody's read it.
Yeah, and really like October 6th is really an opportunity for us to kind of go over it with you and introduce you to it. And then as Diane mentioned, the November meeting would be the kind of the meeting where it's all finalized. But we'll get it out as soon as we can.
That sounds good. Thank you.
Michelle, Robert Lyons is in the building with me here at Legion Hall. I'll ask for his thoughts.
Nothing more at this time. I think everything's looking good. Discuss it more at our over meeting.
Thanks,
Go over the
Robert.
finer details.
Okay, and then I think the last commissioner is Commissioner Cron is on the phone.
Yeah, I'll just add that I love the idea that you're going to kind of reorganize and kind of make things a little more simplified. I know what I've read even recently through the code, trying to find different standards for different districts, like specifically fencing and, sorry if you can hear my kids fighting in the background. It's kind of confusing as far as like it doesn't necessarily separate by like central business district and residential as much. So, I mean, I don't know if you're looking to include that or refine that as much either, but I mean, the more user-friendly, the better. More layman, the better for just to be able to, for people to find things quickly. I know it's been a little kind of confusing with some of that. So, yeah, I just look forward to having a more simplified code. But as far as all the other suggestions, I think everything else sounds really good.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and one thing I might just add is we are trying to simplify and kind of reorganize the best that we can because we're doing kind of more of this sort of piecemeal approach. It can be a little harder to completely reorganize the code. So we're doing the best that we can kind of with the general format, but we are moving things around to consolidate, you know, areas that are relevant. And so we also create something called the residential and a commercial development guide that helps pull together all the different code sections that are relevant. So that's kind of the cliff notes for somebody who's interested in developing a property and maybe doesn't necessarily know where to go within the city code. So it's kind of always a work in progress, and we try to make it as simple to use as possible. And that's definitely, as Diane mentioned, one of the goals of this process. So I guess, Morgan, do you have anything you wanted to add from the planning and zoning perspective? I think that was the last commissioner.
No, not at this level.
Okay, thanks.
I think it'll be easier to sort of get into the specifics when we have that draft out for people to go through. I'm happy to answer any questions people have, though.
Thanks, Morgan, and thank you, Michelle. I think that covers everyone from planning and zoning. Let's move to the county. I believe Cinda Herrick and Sherry Moffin are on online with us, so I would like to hear your perspectives.
This is Cinda. I really have no comments at this time.
Thanks, Cinda.
Yeah, I
Sherry,
appreciate the opportunity. I just appreciate the opportunity to be at the table and listen to what's going on, but I have nothing right now either.
Thank you both. So let me move on to council. I'll start with Tom Sowers, your perspective on today's briefing.
Yeah, very good brief. For this, I guess for the future, just because some of the code stuff changes, it's hard to find. So Morgan and Michelle and Diane, it kind of, when we do our big read through, and have like, this is the current code, and this is where it's located. This is essentially, these are the proposed changes. I know we did this in the past, where it was kind of highlighted in red. And then maybe a little small snippet of why we proposed these changes. Maybe, you know, when we're talking about trees or something like that, we're going to go back on arborists, those kind of things. But overall, I really appreciate all your work and what we're doing to simplify code. Overall, maintain the aesthetics of the mall.
Let's go to Mike. What's your thoughts on today's presentation?
All good. I don't have any questions or comments. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Mike. Colby?
Sorry, searching around for my mute button. I got like a meta screen going here with mute buttons and video and stuff. Yeah, no, thanks for the good presentation. I've just been trying to read along and listen at the same time, so I guess I'd maybe echo Tom's comments that we could take a slightly deeper look into some of these things. But yeah, ultimately, I don't have anything to add at this moment.
Thanks, Colby. Bessie Joe, has Melanie been able to join us? Can you tell? Okay. So then it's back to me. This is Bob. So Diane, if you can hear me, you didn't get a lot of questions during the presentation, but we were all paying attention and it was really helpful. A good PowerPoint. I think Tom's comments and Colby's comments, you've heard those, and I think that'd be helpful to us as we proceed. But speaking for the council, we are prepared to help you meet your objective and deadline, Michelle, for being ready by January 1st. I think that timeline's realistic. So just keep working at informing us the way you have been, and listen to the comments from today as far as suggestions and how we process information. But it's all good. I'm excited, and I think you're on the right track.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We really appreciate that. I know it's very dense and not the most exciting reading, probably not anything you want to snuggle up to at night, but hopefully we can present it in a way that you can understand the changes from what's today and what's being proposed. And we've done that in that delete and underline method, but we'll try to do some better summary of what that means to help everyone. Thanks.
That sounds great. Thanks a lot. Bessie, Joe, and Annette, do we have anything else on our agenda for today?
I don't believe so, Mayor.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We will adjourn.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for attending.
Yep, thanks.